Welcome to episode 22 of the Perrysburg Podcast. I'm your host, Kim Newlove. The Perrysburg Podcast is an informational podcast for prospective, new, and current Perrysburg, Ohio residents. We talk about what's in Perrysburg and why people like to live here. You can find the show notes for this episode on perrysburgpodcast.com. Historic downtown Perrysburg has an interesting history. Local historian and librarian Richard Baranowski helped me learn more about the east side of the 100 block of Louisiana Avenue this fall. In this episode, Richard gives us the history of 101 Louisiana Avenue, where Angel 101 sits today, through 131 Louisiana Avenue, where Huntington Bank sits today. The first half was recorded outside on location in October of 2023, and then the second half was recorded in the local history room at Way Public Library in November of 2023. Without further ado, here's the walking tour of 101 through 131 Louisiana Avenue in historic downtown Perrysburg.
Before we start out, it might be noted the difficulty in determining exact locations of early Perrysburg businesses, or houses for that matter. Perrysburg was divided into lot numbers which could contain more than one building. For example, the buildings in this half of the block up to the alley are all on one lot, lot 345. So when you go to the property conveyance record, it gets confusing to figure out what part of the lot a certain building sat. Furthermore, the person selling or buying may not be the person who was running the business in that particular building. And in the 1800s, buildings and businesses seemed to come and go with great alacrity, always helped along by a few fires. There were no addresses in Perrysburg until 1925. From that time, it gets a little easier to document a building and its businesses. Nonetheless, I found out quite a bit about this stretch, and I think I can make some historical sense of it. 101 Louisiana dates back to the 1830s. Daniel Wheeler built a store here in 1834. It was like Sam Drucker's store in Petticoat Junction. He sold everything. I found that a lot of retail stores were like that in the 1800s. In 1843, the building went to David Wilkinson. He was a steamboat captain, and he used it as a storeroom. There were also two businesses in it, Augustus Hall Grocery and Dry Goods and George Powers Hardware. In 1845, the Brown and Hunt Tin Shop on East Front Street, adjacent to 101, caught on fire. It destroyed the whole corner here. So they started all over again. In 1848, the building burned down again. And did you know that the Presbyterian Church was in here too? Of course, it was a big wooden building then. It didn't look like what it looks like today. And the church used the upper floor. The newspaper reported that it was destroyed in the fire. The Presbyterian Church was in a lot of places in Perrysburg, including where the Way Library is today. That church burned in 1875. But they didn't give up. They finally found a home in 1892 when they opened a new church over on Elm Street. It's still standing and a pretty sight to see, like all the historic churches in Perrysburg. At any rate, here at 101 Louisiana Avenue, Augustus Hall stayed on the site, and after two fires got smart and built a brick building, probably around 1850. And that's the building you see here today. Although it has siding on it, the brick is underneath. Augustus Hall sold insurance and had a dry goods and grocery store. In 1853, Henry Fackelman continued another dry goods store. Now in 1865, it was sold to Dr. John Reinfrank. And he opened a drugstore here, and he probably had his office here too. It might be mentioned that prominent attorney and judge Asher Cook had his office for a time in the upper part of 101, at least in 1860. Asher Cook was married to Amanda Hall, the sister of Augustus, who had this corner building. Conveyance records indicate that Mr. Cook had something to do with the building. He may have been part owner. In fact, this section of buildings here, not only this corner building, but the next building that we're going to talk about, they were often referred to as the Cook Block. It might be mentioned that besides Asher Cook, there were a dozen attorneys in Perrysburg in those days. And why was that? You know, Perrysburg was the county seat until 1870. Now, maybe a lot of people don't know that or forgot it. All county business was done here in Perrysburg. I'm getting a little ahead of my story here. Asher Cook, he moved out of 101. He moved next door, and he actually built the building at 103. The reason I know this is records indicate that it was built in 1865, and I suspect Asher Cook built this building and moved here at that point. In 1872, the Masonic Lodge moved upstairs. Now I'm talking about 103 now, the next one down. And Asher Cook sold the upper floor to the Masonic, so that means he owned the building. So that's our proof that Asher Cook owned 103. In the meantime, let's get back to 101. A lot of businesses in here during the late 1800s. You know, dry goods stores, clothing, shoes. There was a grocery store here in 1876. There was a drugstore later on. In 1881, it was George Getz's grocery store. And it became another grocery store after that under another man, George Bosch. Like I said, businesses came and went with great speed. You know, we look at it today, and it's easy to read in a history book, oh, they were here. Well, you know, a lot of years passed in between. So, you know, things happen, but not as fast as we can read about it in a book, of course. We're still talking about 101, and George Huffman started a restaurant in here. A few years later, you know, mid-1880s, Mr. Huffman had a meat market in 103. Well, he converted that meat market into a saloon, and I think he built a door in between. So Mr. Huffman had a saloon at 103 and a restaurant at 101. Saloons subsidized restaurants just like they do today, no different. But I don't think his restaurant was doing too well, and he finally got out of it in the late 1890s, and he leased 101 to George Reither, who opened an ice cream store and restaurant at that time. I have a picture here of Reither's ice cream shop. If you look at that picture, those are trolley conductors standing in front of the store there. His corner store here, 101, was a trolley stop. This was a busy corner. It was a waiting room for the trolley users and drivers. The drivers apparently switched out here because it shows them all standing there waiting to either coming or going. In fact, behind 101, in their parking lot back there, there's trolley tracks where you could fit two or three trolley cars back there, and I think they just used them as a siding when they weren't using the trolleys, or if they needed extra cars when it was extra busy. And the tracks are still back there, buried, as are all the trolley tracks that came through the middle of Perrysburg. If you notice, if you look at Louisiana Avenue, it's kind of mounded in the middle. The trolley tracks went down right down the middle of the street. And if you look down about, I don't know, 2 feet under asphalt, the trolley tracks are still under Louisiana Avenue. We're around 1900 here at 101. Of course, the streetcars were in business in Perrysburg from 1894 to 1925 when buses replaced them. Now, here's another photo of the ice cream shop. That's George Reither out front. You know, I don't think he could make it in this store. George Huffman took it back in 1903. After Mr. Reither, there were various transactions noted in the Perrysburg Journal at 101 concerning a man named Sam Cross, who leased the restaurant from George Huffman for a few years. Now, when Sam Cross had the restaurant, which was in 1905, one of the worst crimes in Perrysburg history occurred right in front of this door. Of course, the door, if you notice by the photo, was in the middle of the building then. It was not on the corner like it is today in 2023. At any rate, let me tell you about that story. Late one night, December 28th, 1905, 5 men got off the streetcar and went into Cross's restaurant right here, 101. 4 guys were at the counter and 1 was standing by the door. Now, Marshal Frank Thornton had been tipped off by telephone about these guys. They may have been wanted in Toledo. Well, Marshal Thornton came in and told them they were under arrest. The gang opened fire on the marshal, and he got shot in the stomach. The gang ran west on Front Street and got away. The marshal was taken home. Later, they took him to Toledo Hospital, where he died several days later. They eventually caught 2 members of the gang, and they were sent to prison. At any rate, according to the Perrysburg Journal, Sam Cross did not keep this place. George Huffman took it back. I'm not sure what happened. Sam probably couldn't make it either. Around 1910, George Huffman still had the restaurant, although Joe Huffman, a cousin, was running it by now. He apparently talked one of his relatives into taking it over, huh? About 1915, 1920, 101 became Travis Pharmacy, which in turn became Hayward's Drugstore. Now this is getting us up into the 1930s and 40s, and actually 1958. It was Hayward's Drugstore until 1958, when it became a restaurant and saloon again called Bishop's. So about 1964, the restaurant had gone out of there and it was renamed the Corner Bar. In 1968, it became the Vance Florist Shop. The Corner Bar moved on to the middle of the 200 block of Louisiana Avenue, but still kept its name. Didn't seem to hurt business at all either. So the building was handed off to another florist called the Flower Shop, or Perrysburg Flower Shop, and it remained so for 35 years. Now, Angel's in here today, and she's had it since about 2014. The upstairs is rented out as apartments or offices. 101 is presently owned by John Naylor. In fact, he owns every building in this half of the block here, except 105. Now, we mentioned that Asher Cook, the attorney, he owned this building. And that's where his office was. And from what we could gather from a newspaper, Perrysburg Journal, he built this place and moved here from the upper floor of 101 over to here. Asher Cook sold the upper story to the Masonic Lodge. County records indicate that he did that in 1872. So Asher Cook is downstairs, the Masonic is upstairs. Later, in the 1880s, I mentioned that George Huffman had a meat market here and then a saloon. But the saloon only was in 103 till 1908. Now, why was that? Now, here's something maybe not a lot of people know. Wood County went dry in 1908. Prohibition really didn't start till 1920 nationally, but places went dry before that, before the whole country went dry. And Wood County, they had a vote, local option, and they voted the county dry in 1908. So that means they kicked all the saloons out in 1908. And there were about 10 saloons in Perrysburg, 90 in Wood County. Like I say, Prohibition didn't happen all at once. It came in fragments, villages, townships, counties, states. Wood County was mostly rural, and although Perrysburg voted against Prohibition, there were more others in the county who didn't. In other words, people in Perrysburg liked to drink, but the people in Bowling Green didn't. So Wood County went dry 12 years before the rest of the country. People from Lucas County could still drink, of course. And people in Perrysburg would take the trolley to Maumee, which was Lucas County, a wet county, with their empty suitcases and come clanking back to Perrysburg. You know, that's probably one of the reasons why Prohibition really didn't work. You know, you can't hardly have liquor legal and then 2 feet away have it illegal. That just doesn't work. Now look, there's a photo. You can right at this point. I'm going to show a photo of the Rossbach Brothers Billiards Hall. This is early 1910s, and this is 103. It was run by the Rossbach brothers, George and Fred Rossbach. They opened in 1909, right after the county went dry. And they were in several places around town. They had pool halls, cigar stores. They were not very successful. According to their nephew, Stanley Rossbach, their assorted businesses were more of a social thing. They never made any money. In this pool hall, the Rossbach brothers sold soft drinks and near beer. I mentioned this near beer. I don't know if you've ever heard of it or not. It's tasteless stuff, but it was popular during Prohibition because it tasted like beer and didn't have any alcohol in it, or so people thought. But what they would do, have you ever heard of the term needled beer? Well, what they would do in Prohibition, they'd barrel this near beer at the company, and then somewhere between the company and where they were going to sell it, they would take a veterinarian's needle, fill it with alcohol, and inject the barrel with this alcohol. You'd have a keg of near beer after it left the brewery, beer with alcohol in it after it got to where they were selling it. The Rossbach brothers' nephew, Stanley Rossbach, told me, he said they probably sold this in here, and he says, I think they probably sold stronger stuff too. At any rate, the Rossbach brothers are downstairs, and the Masonic Lodge is still upstairs. Now we see the picture of the Arts Saloon. The Arts Saloon was in business in, 1880s, 1890s. The saloon, with a little remodeling, later became D.K. Hollenbeck's law office. They called it the Little Courthouse because that's what it looked like. If you look at that little inset in the photo, when you look at the Arts Bar, you can see that they remodeled that bar into a law office. I'm gonna show you a photo of the 1920s. Now you see this photo of the early 1920s. A brick facade was put across the front over into 105. This was in 1920. See this brick facade? It covers up buildings behind there. That's not a real building behind there. Not a real building. They just did it for looks. I think the Masonic probably built it, and they wanted it to look nice up there for their meetings and how it looked from the outside. At any rate, when they did that, they moved that little courthouse out to the Robert Pugh Estate at 535 East Front Street, and it's still there. And if you look at that little inset on the photo there, if you go back in that person's driveway behind their house, that little building sits back there. That a lot of people don't know that that's there. And it was actually up here, right in front of us here. In 1942, 103 became Martin and Huff's grocery store. It had apparently taken over for an A&P, which had expanded into 105. Martin and Huff went out of business in 1954. And that same year, Kroger, which was at 109 since the 20s, had expanded into 107. Now, we've got more addresses than we have buildings. So some of the buildings, 107 and 109, are the same building here as we see it today. There were two grocery stores side by side here for many years during the 40s and 50s. We think of Kroger as being a great big grocery store. Well, when they first came to Perrysburg, they were just as small as one of these buildings doing business up here today. Okay, 103, afterwards, it became Stewart Infrared. They were a company that sold infrared stoves. You usually found them in bars and so forth, and they had sandwiches that they could cook. It was like a microwave, but a prehistoric microwave. And the Stewart Infrared sold the sandwiches and distributed them around different businesses around Perrysburg and Toledo. And they sold those ovens. I guess they were called ovens back then. But they were about the size of, not much bigger than a microwave. So 103 has been a lot of different things over the years. It was Serendipity, which was a gift shop. It was Violet's Clothing. And later in the 1970s, it became the Fashion Closet. Like I say, the upstairs remained the Masonic for many years, up until the 1970s at least. Now let's go to 105. 105 was built in the 1920s for the Masonic. The Masonic built it, and they rented out the bottom, and that the upstairs was added on to 103, which they combined into one big hall, if you can follow me on that. That's probably when that facade was put in. So now the Masonic owns the upstairs of 103 and 105. 105, like I said before, was a series of grocery stores, Martin and Huff, A&P. The Masons were still using the upstairs. A floor covering shop came in the late 1950s, and in the 1960s and 70s, it was George Garn's real estate office. In the 80s, it became a clothing store called Bloomers, and another one called Clothes Horse later on in the 1990s. I think an attorney owns 105. It's the only building in this half block not owned by John Naylor. Now, we're going to go down to 107 and 109. As you can see, 107 and 109 are the same building, at least today. The Perrysburg Post Office was actually in 107 from around 1890 to the early 1930s. And then it moved over to 110 West 2nd Street. And then in 1941, it moved next to Kazmeyer's. I think there's a fitness, it's a fitness building now. And then in 1990, the post office moved out the road where it is today. Later, after Kroger came in during the 1920s, expanding from 109 into 107. Kroger's was in here from 1930s, I think, till 1954. And then People's Market came in, another grocery store. They moved here in 107 and 109 in 1955, and People's Market stayed in business here till 1972. West Haven Drugstore came in 107 after People's Market. They were in here till 1978, and then it became headquarters for a limited corporation, and S.J.'s Emporium came in the 1980s, and then by 1989 it was a wedding apparel shop. In 1999 it became Wurtzel Photography. There have been different businesses in here the last 20 years. George Mosier replaced the old wooden building you saw in the 1910s in that photo with a new brick building. It became a Studebaker dealership. Now we're looking at the 109 upper level. They actually fixed cars in the second story of that brick building of 109. There was an elevator in there. Even for 1910s and 20s, I don't know, that was pretty advanced. And it was a Studebaker dealership. If you refer back to that 1920s picture, you will see 111 says garage. They must have used both places to fix cars, because 111 is the next one down. We're standing here in front of 111 Louisiana Avenue. It's this tall building, 3 stories. It was built in 1900 by George Mosier. He built this after Chris Huffman's grocery store had burned down, and he bought the property and he put up a brand new building. It was actually he actually built it as a saloon, because the ground floor was designed as a cafe with a long mahogany bar. And he might not have done this if he knew Prohibition was coming in 1908, at least for Wood County. Now I'm going to show you a photo of Chris Huffman's grocery store. Okay, if you study the picture, you can see the store went into 109, and you can also see an edge of Arch's Saloon. The second floor was apartments. The third floor was a dance hall. It was also called the Royal Theater, and it was called a Nickelodeon in those days. The Nickelodeon opened in 1908 and operated for several years. And of course, they showed silent movies in here. And it cost a nickel to get in, thus Nickelodeon. And I understand they had a piano player in there and a singer to keep the place alive when they changed movie reels. Now, if you've ever seen the steps that go up to the third floor in this building, you'll wonder how they ever got a piano up in that third floor. They must have hoisted it through the window, because I don't believe they'd ever got one up there. The steps are so narrow, one person can barely walk through them. At any rate, 111 holds the distinction as being the tallest building in uptown Perrysburg. And yes, I refer to uptown as the term for Perrysburg, because that's the term everybody used during the 20th century. You know, downtown was Toledo. Uptown was Perrysburg. When someone mentioned they were going uptown, they were going uptown Perrysburg. When they said they were going downtown, they were going downtown Toledo to Tidke's or someplace. But that term has changed, and now uptown Perrysburg has become downtown Perrysburg. Okay, to get back to 111, it has been many things over the years. I guess when the saloons went out of Perrysburg, they converted 111, well, like I said, was a Studebaker dealership, and they fixed cars here. There was even a gas pump out front here at one time. So 111 was a lot of things over the years. And 111 is sometimes mentioned as the tourist hotel because they use several rooms up above here. If you look above 111, you got the second and third floor. It was like a tourist hotel. You know, people that were staying in town for short amounts of time, they could rent rooms up there. Some of the rooms were actually in 109 up above as well. The tourist hotel stayed in business. Is that sign still up there? Did they take that down?
Yep,
It's still there. Tourist hotel is still there. It was a tourist hotel from like the 1910s up into 2004. When it caught on fire, they remodeled it, and it's been apartments ever since then. You know, when they first rented it out, it was like $1 a night for a room. So it was sort of a transient, short-term motel for people. Now, I mentioned 111 was a Studebaker dealership. And then after the Studebaker dealership went out in around 1930s or so, it became a hardware store. Now, I'm just talking about the bottom level of 111. You know, the upstairs is the tourist hotel. And the downstairs was actually a couple of different hardware stores over the years, from the 1940s to the 1960s. Service Hardware, Perrysburg Hardware, Western Auto in 1968. It became an interior decorating shop in the 1970s. Print and Print in 1980s and 90s, and it's been Kids Clothesline since 2000. Businesses moved in different places. You know, that's a lot of time, like people get in arguments about where businesses were located in the older days. Well, the same business might have been in 3 different places, all correct. For example, the Kroger store that was in 109, 107, it was in the other side of the alley. It was in that second building there. So it moved from down there to 3 buildings down here. So it was in 2 different places. And now it's in another place because it's out on Route 20. That completes the history of 111. We're going to go down to 113. Okay, now we go to actually 113 and 115. Again, it's the same building with 2 different addresses in it. Now, Mr. Mosier, George Mosier, built 113 and 115 in the early 1900s. 113 held a variety of businesses. It was sometimes called the Northwest Ohio Natural Gas Company. It was a jewelry store for a while. It was a tiny tot and teen clothing store up until about 1964. And Charlie Lober went in here in 1965, and he sold radios and TVs. And in the early 80s, it was a video store. In 1991, 113 was Silver Faucet. I don't know, they must have, I'm not sure what they sold. At any rate, that's what they called the place, Silver Faucet. And then it became Santa Fe Way in 1995, which was sort of a gift shop and maybe kind of an art shop. Okay, now we look over here at 115. Early in the 1900s, it was Charlie Mills's barber shop. And I think it was a barber shop for quite a while. There might have been other things in between there, but I found out in 1932, Jim Tippin opened a restaurant here, more like a counter and stools and a penny slot machine. He sold 3-2 beer. He was one of the first people to get beer when booze came back in 1933. He ran this restaurant. I must have run it just on a shoestring until the beer came back, and then he didn't have too much trouble. Later on, he was able to enlarge, and he moved further down the block. Later, 115 became Star Barber Shop. That was in the late 1930s. And it became a beauty salon in 1948. And it's continued as different beauty shops, it seems like, until up to today. I don't think there's anything been in there except, of course, under different owners was a beauty shop. That concludes the first half block of the east side of Louisiana Avenue, the 100 block. Now we're going to cross the alley. These addresses are 117 to 131, and they're all on lot 380. Now I want you to look at the photo of the first part of this block. It's Harriet's, Pyatt's, and Kessler's. These are the next four buildings we're going to be looking at. Okay, now the first one here on the alley, it's 117. That's the 3-story building we're looking at here. And it was built by Rudolph Dance in 1877. He had a bakery here, and the second floor was used for lodge meetings. It's likely he lived on the 3rd floor. When Dance moved his bakery and other retail services such as kids' toys, school books, and supplies across the street, he sold to John Amon, and Mr. Amon opened a hardware store here in 1891. Mr. Amon sold it to John Stalder in 1926, who continued it as a hardware. By 1934, it was called Service Hardware. By 1940, it had become an Isley's ice cream shop, and it remained so till 1945. Dick Huffman bought the building in 1945 and rented it to Casual Clothes. The upstairs, 2nd and 3rd floor, were apartments. The bottom floor became the Perry Petite Shop in 1954, then renamed Harriet's for owner Harriet Culbertson in the 1960s. Harriet retired in 1974. I talked with her one time, and Harriet told me that she thought the petite part of her business name were keeping people away who thought she only sold petite clothes. So that's why she changed the name. I think it was around 1968 or 69. From the Perry Petite Shop to Harriet's. The business continued as a ladies' clothing store until 1994. Then Central Travel went in 1996, and they were there up until the mid-2000s. Then came a short-lived yogurt shop, and I think another coffee shop was in there. Maddie and Bella's coffee shop opened in 2013, and of course they're here today. Now, 119 and 121 are sort of a mystery to me. Now, if you look again at the photo I gave you, you can see that 119 and 121, by the look of them, they were built at the same time, and I think it was around 1840. The brother of Augustus Hall, this is from bits and pieces I got from the Perrysburg Journal, James Manning Hall, appears to have built them. He also built 123, perhaps before these buildings. He had owned a general store, and then he was postmaster, an insurance man, maybe all at the same time. At any rate, the Perrysburg Journal said in 1839 that Hall's new brick building was opposite the Eagle Tavern. The Eagle Tavern is where the Perrysburg Messenger building is today, which, by the way, is the oldest building in uptown or downtown Perrysburg. In 1865, John Eberly bought 119 for $550. He was a boot and shoemaker, and he later built a shop up at 201 up in the next block beyond 2nd Street. Like I say, these businesses, these folks moved around quite a bit.
looking for a bigger place or better place or a cheaper rental or who knows, for a variety of reasons. In 1873, George and John Huffman bought the building for $2,000. They had a grocery store in here for many years. George gave it to his son Bill in 1919, then it went to Lula Kazmaier. Kroger bought it in the 1920s. In 1932, Kroger went down to 109. After Kroger left, William Campbell came in and bought the building for $4,500 in 1932. He continued a grocery here. In the meantime, a man named William Richards acquired the building in 1935, and he sold it to John Pyatt, actually Earl Pyatt, came in 1940. Earl rented it until he bought it in 1953. They gave it to their son John in 1983, and he sold it to Stephen Nitschke in 1998 for $58,000, and the Nitschke family still owns it. In 2010, it became, actually in the 90s, let's back up a minute. In the 90s, it was the Ribbonry, and it was run by Kamala Nitschke. In 2010, it became Meg, a women's clothing store, and that's what it is today, and the Ribbonry moved upstairs. Okay, now we get to 121. There were no doubt different businesses here since 1840. It's Framer's Workshop today. I can get back to the 1870s on this building. Jacob Schlecht had a harness shop here. He actually competed with his father, who had a harness shop where Lupita's is today. There's probably a story here somewhere, but I don't know what that might be, but I think the father and son were competitors. By 1914, 121 was a pool hall and a cigar store run by Zen Harper, and I think I read somewhere that he lived above it, at least for a short period of time. I think, we're talking 1914. If you recall, Wood County went dry in 1908. And I think the guys that used to hang around the bars had no place to go, and these pool halls kind of took up the business. If you remember, the Rossbach brothers had a pool hall in the first part of this block for a time. How much alcohol was involved I don't know, that's another question, but I'm sure it was floating around a little bit. At any rate, in the 1920s and 30s, Herman Starr had a barbershop here, and he shared space with the pool hall, if you can imagine that. I think there was sort of a wall, or it was the barbershop connected to the pool hall. Later in 1924, his wife Lavina opened a beauty salon, and the pool tables came out, and there was probably no more card playing in there either. So she took the other side of the building, and they probably had a wall there. They said there were booths where you could wait, there were seats where you could wait, and so forth. We can figure the barber shop and the beauty salon were sort of partitioned off a little bit. And the couple lived upstairs. Their daughter, Melba, also became a beautician, and she worked in here as well. She later moved down to the first part of the block in that, I think it was 115, that one by the alley that I told you was a beauty shop for many years and still is today. So Melba Starr was in there for a long time. In 1940, 121 became J&H Menswear. In 1957, it became Kessler's Menswear. And he was in there for a very long time, till 1980, when it switched businesses and became Bernina Swiss Sewing Center. And then after that, for a short time, it was Paisanello's Pizza Place. That was like in the early 1990s. Then it became Santa Fe Way, which was sort of a gift shop. Framer's has been in here about 10 years. Let's go down to the next building, which is 123. I want you to look at that outside picture. This is Munger Brothers Meat Market. I have a picture of three fellas standing in front of the Munger Brothers. That's George Munger there on the right. I don't know who those other two fellows are. They don't, usually you can tell a Munger from a mile away. They don't look like, they must have been just maybe helpers, or maybe the one guy was just walking by, was a friend just shooting the breeze. The other fellow with the apron, he worked in there. You can see that, but I don't think he was part of the family. The earliest history I have on this building is a land record from 1839. The real estate this building sits on was bought by the aforementioned James Manning Hall for $100. He eventually put up a building and sold dry goods. Now, I'm not sure if this building, it's not clear whether this building went up after the two that we just looked at or went up afterwards. I have a suspicion that it went afterwards, but I can't be sure. At any rate, Gilbert Beach acquired this building in the 1860s, and he sold dry goods. But records indicate he was foreclosed, and a woman named Roxana Baker either took it back or bought it. She sold it to George and John Munger in 1880 for $2,400, who had been renting it for several years. And like I said, there's that photo of George Munger wearing an apron. I think this photo is from the 1910s. Now let's look inside the building when the Munger brothers had it. Now you'll note there's a picture there of the inside, and you can see cuts of beef hanging on the wall there. And George Munger, young George Munger, is in the apron there to the left, and his father is standing next to him on the right, and that's George Munger Sr., and he owned the whole shooting match there. He and his two brothers, John and Charles and Henry. But at this point, there were only three brothers because John had died in 1904. So just George, who you see there, and his brother Charles and Henry ran it. I think his son George eventually bought it and took it over. I see that, you see that meat hanging there. It looks like they must have salted at least some of it because, they had to preserve it some way. They had a special ice room in the back where they stored ice. It was a real squat, low-ceiling building, which was how ice houses were built back then. I think they were able to keep the meat at least semi-refrigerated. The Munger brothers, they started their meat market in 1879, and these guys, they were smart guys. They decided to cut out the middleman, and they brought their cattle into Perrysburg by train and butchered it as needed. Their slaughterhouse was out by Fort Meigs Cemetery near the railroad. They were in business here till about 1925 when George Schwinn bought their meat business. Since then, it was it's been a five and dime store. Later, it was split, and in 1950, by the 50s, 56, a barber, Kenny Gordon, was on the left. Hayes Travel was on the right side. Later on, 123 on the right became Hayden Miller Investments, and Eckard's Lock Service came in 1976. They were in here for over 20 years. The barber shop continued on the left side. Kenny Gordon retired, and Jack Wolf took it over, and he was in there for till the 1980s. The Ice House, if we walk to the side here of the bank parking lot, we can walk back and take a look at the Ice House. It still exists. Today, 123 is the Haven, and I think it's a beauty salon or hairdresser. And I think they sell beauty supplies in there as well. So at any rate, we're going to go to a new photo here. There's a photo of three, we're in the bank parking lot now, okay? And this photo is from around 1910s probably. And you see there were three wooden buildings where the bank parking lot is today. It looks like they all didn't fit in there. All the bank is added on to their side a little bit. But there were three businesses in there. So 125 is the first one. And I found a barber shop here in 1884 and in 1893. But I'm not sure if it was the same building. There might have been a different building there, and they replaced it with this one. It was the Perrysburg Variety Store for many years in the 1920s. Later on, it became Frank Gulick Furniture Store. Ray Bernard actually lived here around 1950 for several years. And later, it was Carl Steinman used car dealer. This building was torn down in 1960, and the bank, which we are going to come to eventually, bought it. Now let's go to 127. That's the middle building there. It was a harness shop in 1893. Art Thornton's bakery came soon after. He moved his bakery here in 1905, and from where Waterford Bank is today. And he bought this building for $1,000 in 1905. And he was in business until the late 1940s. Perrysburg Paint and Wallpaper went in there. Then after them, an upholstery shop. It went vacant and into disrepair. In 1962, the bank bought it and tore it down. Now, 129. In 1884, I found a grocery store here, but I'm not sure it was, again, it's the same building you see in the photo. In 1893, it was a grocery saloon. It later had two successive confectionery stores, ice cream stores is what they called those in the early 1930s, or a candy store, early 1900s, up until the 1920s. So from 1900 to 1920, it was a candy and ice cream store. They had several names. Moons ran it for a while, and then it later became Shepherd's. In the mid-1930s, it was Stanford's Plumbing Shop. In 1939, the Tourist Inn moved in. Remember Mr. Tippin? He was at 115 in the early 1930s, up the block. Mr. Tippin ran this bar restaurant until 1958, when the business moved again up the street to 215. 129 was torn down in June of 1959 when the bank bought it. Consequently, we find that Mr. Tippin had the same business in 3 different locations. Just an example of how merchants move their businesses around in Perrysburg in those days. Okay, that brings us to 137, and that's the Huntington Bank. Actually, it's 131 today. They changed the address on it at some point. It's another story, but they readjusted the addresses around 1950 in Perrysburg on Louisiana Avenue and all the tree streets, just for growth reasons. Like I said, the bank in the 1930s, they were 137, but today 131. I got as far back as the 1850s for this property. There was a dry goods store here and a grocery store in the 1850s. Somewhere on this lot, perhaps at the back of the present Huntington Bank, towards the back of the building there, was the Perrysburg Bank building. It housed Perrysburg's first bank, started in 1857 by one man, Jesse Norton. Now let me reiterate, it was not this building we are looking at today, it was a different building. This Jesse Norton, he was the bank. He and a man named James Murray, a lawyer, owned the building, and they called it the bank building. But it was not just a bank, it held several law offices. One-time mayor, the aforementioned James Murray, was in here, as was Henry Dodge and Patrick Slevin. I found a jewelry store, too, in this building at some point. The bank didn't last long. The building itself, I think, sat back farther away from Louisiana than the present bank does. At any rate, the Perrysburg Bank building was somewhere in this parking lot or somewhere on this corner. The Rhine-Frank building succeeded it in 1881. I don't know if John Rhine-Frank built a new building or used part of the Perrysburg Bank building. He paid $3,000 for this spot, so there was probably a building on it. Well, Dr. Rhine-Frank had his office here, as it was referred to as the Rhine-Frank building. He left here in 1897, and with his son, Dr. William Rhine-Frank, moved to their new hospital on West Front Street next to Hood Park. The building is still there next to Hood Park and divided up into offices. William Rhine-Frank was the famous thyroid doctor and specialized in goiter surgery. Patients came from all over to be treated by him. Dr. John Rhine-Frank sold this corner here to the present bank for $1,800, and they tore down what was here. He apparently lost money on the place. I don't know, it must not have been the right time to sell. And there is a right time and a wrong time to sell property in Perrysburg. This structure has been a bank for 120 years. It was built in 1906 and called the Perrysburg Banking Company. Then in 1962, it merged with the Perrysburg Bank of Wood County. Then it merged again with Huntington in 1974. Now, what do you see strange about this building? They remodeled the bottom twice, first with bricks in 1959, and then later on with they put this wood on it in 1979. That's when they built an addition and the drive-through ports. But they never remodeled the top of the building. The upstairs has been home to dentists, a beauty salon, and attorneys' offices. Carlos Cordova was up here for a long time, from 1950s up into the 80s or 90s, till he retired. Okay, now I want to show you I have a whole photo of the block here. I guess the bank has I have a little story about the bank, which I'll finish up this talk here. During its history, Perrysburg has been subject to various bank robberies. 8 different occasions, after I checked the newspapers, indicate that banks have been robbed around Perrysburg. All but one of these robberies occurred at banks straddling the interstate, affording the individuals a fast and unimpeded getaway. However, the first bank robbery in Perrysburg, which utilized an automobile, took place in 1919 at this bank, then the Perrysburg Banking Company. Like I said, I'll finish up with a little story about the bank robbery. It was October of 1919. 4 men pulled up in a Cadillac in front of the Perrysburg Hospital on 2nd Street in Locust. There used to be a hospital down there. It's a vacant lot today. They pretended to tinker with the engine, awaiting the lookout who went ahead to case the bank 2 blocks down. Well, Thomas Franey, the bank cashier, Bertha Cranker, the bookkeeper, and a customer were inside when the 3 pistol-carrying robbers struck about 9:30 a.m. Miss Cranker had her back to the door, and the robbers walked up to her teller's cage and said, "Hands up." Her friends did this all the time to her, and she paid no attention. They repeated themselves, and one of the men shattered the glass in the cage with his pistol. That did make her turn around, and she saw the gun pointed at her. Bertha was a no-nonsense career woman, and she tried to hide some of the loose bills on the counter. One of the robbers grabbed her by the waist and threw her under a table. The robbers then went to the office door of Tom Franey, ordering him out. He too thought it was a joke at first, and they broke the glass in his door and herded him out in the lobby with the others. And all 3 were ordered into the vault, the door of which stood open. They were going to lock the people in the vault, but Franey said he didn't have the combination to close the vault door. The robbers wanted to get into the safety deposit boxes, but Franey stalled them, and they didn't get in there. So all were dragged into the washroom. During this time, a customer unwittingly walked into the bank. He was hit 5 times on the head with the butt of a revolver and thrown into the washroom as well. This was an extremely violent gang. They cleaned out the vault and cashier's drawer, and they escaped with about $4,200, a pretty good haul for those days. I think it'd be about over $50,000 in today's money. They had been in the bank for approximately a half an hour. They ran out the door with a 4th man at the wheel of the getaway car. Another person walked in the bank and let the group out of the washroom. And there was, they called the sheriff. There was massive confusion as to the direction the bandits went. The sheriff went several different ways trying to figure out where they went, but the gang got away. However, Dr. Bowers down at the hospital had spotted the car and men in front of the hospital, unmistakably strangers in this then village of 2,000 people. He described the car to the sheriff, noting an unusual detail. The Cadillacs back then, the back window had 3 separate panes. One pane was patched over with black oilcloth. So during the investigation, it was discovered that a garage man from Perrysburg remembered it as a car he had recently worked on, and they got the license number. Toledo police found the car the next day, abandoned in downtown Toledo. And a half an hour after the car was found, a lady called of Mrs. Julius Jaffa of Prospect Avenue reported it stolen. Her husband was a taxi cab driver. He was arrested the next day, and he was the fellow. They found out who did it, and they were taken to the Wood County Jail by the sheriff. I might add that a few years later, when the Depression-era outlaws descended upon this part of the country, the Midwest, there were an epidemic of bank robberies, but Perrysburg was left untouched, not a single bank robbery. Villages such as White House, Lucky, and Waterville, they were not so fortunate. They were always robbing Waterville because as soon as you left, you were in the country and long gone. Although the famous, infamous outlaws of the period, Pretty Boy Floyd and John Dillinger, came through here at different times, they passed up Perrysburg, probably thinking it too risky. It's too tight, and it was close to a metropolitan area. They liked wide open spaces with no railroad tracks. It would be a long time between robberies. It took 56 years. July 2nd, 1975, Perrysburg's next bank robbery was the old Home Federal, now Key Bank on Louisiana and Boundary. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed it. Maybe get a better idea of Perrysburg's history, of itself and its buildings. And that's the end of the building tour of the 100 block of the east side of Louisiana Avenue.
Thank you for listening to episode 22 of the Perrysburg Podcast. Please visit perrysburgpodcast.com to read the show notes. In the show notes, you'll find a list of the addresses from the walking tour, a link to Way Public Library, which is where Richard Baranowski is a librarian, and a link to the YouTube version of this episode. If you know someone who enjoys Perrysburg history, please share this episode with them. And if you like this podcast, please subscribe to or follow the Perrysburg Podcast on your favorite podcast player and YouTube to get each new episode right when it comes out. Thanks again for listening today. I'll talk to you next Friday.